I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the Backstrom Holocaust Survivor Lecture Series. We are very fortunate to have with us today someone who has witnessed and survived the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. I'm hoping that you will come away from this lecture with something meaningful, something that you can remember, and hopefully the spirit to do something in the future to prevent genocides from happening again to any form of humanity, anywhere in the world at any time. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Hersch Altman.
I was asked to speak to you today about a subject that is very important to me. That is what happens when we let prejudice, bigotry, and hatred run rampant. I know what happens because I lived through a period and by some miracle survived when prejudice and bigotry and hatred were their zenith. I'm a Holocaust survivor. None of us is born prejudiced or bigoted or a hate monger. We learn it. We learn it from our friends, from our relatives, and from our families. So it's probably foolish for me to think that I can come in here and in a mere 45 minutes or 50 minutes convince you to give up any prejudices, should you have any. It does not necessarily mean that a Holocaust or a genocide has to happen to the Jewish people. We Jews do not have a monopoly on prejudice. Here are a couple of articles. I'd just like to read a couple of excerpts for you. More than 1 million people were butchered during what the Clinton administration described as an effort by the Hutu government to exterminate the Rwanda Tutsis. There's something that came out of the Globe just yesterday, or maybe it was before, maybe it was the day before. Rwanda's prepared to mark the 94 genocide. Next week will mark the 10th anniversary. Look what happened to the former Yugoslavia. When I first heard the expression ethnic cleansing, my hair stood on end. It was all I could think of when Hitler said 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. He said Judenrein. He meant it against the Jews. But as I just showed you, that does not necessarily have to mean that the Jews have a monopoly of it. How does all this start? Do we start hating everybody who is not from our country? Or those who are from our country, but maybe from a different part of the country? Hey, those who have a different color skin, or different color hair. Or hey, those who pray differently than we do or don't pray at all. Do we finally begin to hate people in our own family who are different than we are? So when you go home today, I'd like you to think not about the man who stood in front of you today, but I would like you to think about a little boy. A little boy who at the age of 10 saw his father and the entire intelligentsia of his hometown taken like a very heavy guard, like the worst of criminals, and taken to the local jail. And for the next 2 days, this little boy circled the walls of this jail, hoping to see his father again. The father he loved so very much, and in vain. Because when he got there on the 3rd day, the jail was empty. Early that morning, they were all taken to the nearby woods, shot and buried in a mass grave. Think about a little boy with the age of 12, lost his entire family. His father, his mother, and his 3 sisters. They were all executed because the crime that they have committed was having been born Jewish. Think about a little boy who at the age of 12 or 13 who should have gone to school, then come home to a warm family, have a warm meal, sleep in a soft bed. But instead, he was always hungry and running for his life. Because he too was committed to die. And for some miracle, he was always one step ahead of his executioners. Think about a little boy who through the months of July and August, where the heat was the worst, he was hiding in the field under the hot sun with no water and just a hard loaf of bread, praying for rain, because he needed the rain to cool his body or be able to sip some of the water off the stalks of the wheat. And then when night came and he had no clothes to change to, he was all wet, cold, he was still hungry. He would risk his life and sneak into a barn, into a farmer's barn, dodge the wild dogs and everything, and then dig himself deep into the hay and stay there 2 or 3 days until the clothes on his back would dry. But then in the middle of the day, when he got so lonely, and he would climb to the top of the hay there, make sure there's nobody in the barn, and then look through a crack in the barn wall, and then look children of his own age out there laughing and running and playing. He would look up to his God. He came from a very religious family. He would look up to his God and say, God, why me? Am I not made of the same flesh and blood that these kids are out there? Don't I have to eat when I'm hungry and drink when I'm thirsty? You know, there were times when he wanted to cry so badly, but he couldn't cry anymore because he had no tears left to cry. Let me share with you just one day in this little boy's life. It was Yom Kippur 1942. It was exactly 1 year since my father was killed. I got up early that morning, into the flickering light of a memorial candle, and was reading from the book of Psalms. When my oldest sister came running in and told us that there was an aktion, or a raid going on outside. What that meant was that any Jew who was caught during a raid was loaded into a cattle car and taken for extermination into a concentration camp. Mother called us together, the 4 children, and she told that she had made arrangements with a Gentile woman at the outskirts of town to take Shansha, my youngest sister, and me in and hide us until after the accident. Of course, Shansha and I didn't want to go. We cried, we asked, we want to stay together with Mother. But she had a good reason. She said, if we're caught, let's not all get killed at the same time. Maybe some of us will survive. Well, it didn't take much effort for 2 little kids who knew the town very well to get out of town. But unfortunately, by the time we got to the outskirts, the streets were already blocked by the Gestapo. There was a field, an empty field, which ran along the road. Shansha and I decided maybe we can just sneak through the fields and get by the Gestapo. But unfortunately, there was this Polish woman, a neighbor, a woman who lived next to these friends, so to speak, for years. She was out there gloating and happy to see her neighbors being rounded up to be taken to the slaughter. She pointed us out to the Gestapo. And 2 soldiers came running after us as the 2 little kids with their guns drove. And they took us back into town with a dozen other Jews. It brought us to this large area which was surrounded by walls, by buildings on two sides, and SS with machine guns on the other two sides. And we were told to sit on the ground, and anybody who dared to stand up would be automatically shot. And before the day was over, 2 people were shot to death because for some reason they dared to stand up. As the day wore on, more and more people were brought to this area. We were one of the early ones, one of the first ones to have been brought. So they pushed us further and further against the wall, until I found myself leaning against the wall. It was in the middle of the afternoon, or early afternoon actually. I was tired and hungry and scared. I put my head against the wall and started to doze. When my hand felt something, felt like a little window leading to the basement. I showed it to my sister, and she and I tried to open it, pull it open. But unfortunately, we were 2 little kids and couldn't do it. So my sister suggested that this man who sat next to me, if he and I try to pull it open, while she blocks us from view, maybe we'll have more success. And sure enough, he and I, a couple of pulls, and we opened it. As soon as people saw the window open, they started sliding down into this basement. I wanted my sister to go first, but she said to me, "No, Hersh, you must go first. Because with our father now dead, and if you don't come back, Mother will have a very, very difficult time of it." And she pushed me towards the window. And there I found myself in the darkness of this basement. People kept sliding down, and I kept calling her name, and all I heard was, "Shut, be quiet," because they may hear you. But none of those voices were my sister's. Because she was still sitting up there, blocking the window from view so other people can slide in. I had to make my way out from this basement. And there was some sort of a lumber yard or something in the backyard. There was many of them which we thought were nice hiding spaces. But unfortunately, by the time I got to these places, they were all full of people already. And they kept telling me, "Go away, there's no room for you here." Even though I was the one who first opened it up, but there was no room for them. The last place I looked in, there was this old man with this yellow beard. He looked up at me, I'll never forget that face. He looked up at me with those red eyes and pointed at the fence. And in Yiddish he said, "Läuf, mein Kind, läuf. Run, my child, run." I don't know how, but I scaled the wall and jumped. I was no more than about 300 or 400 feet away from the wall when I heard 2 shots. And when I turned around, there was this body of this man falling to the ground. Because by that time, the Gestapo had noticed the escape. And 2 soldiers came around the building, and they caught him just as he too tried to jump to safety. Whether they didn't see me or they thought I was a little Polish boy, they did not stop me. And I went away. That afternoon, my sister and several thousand other Jews were loaded into cattle cars and taken to concentration camps, where they perished. And I saw or heard from my sister again. You know, there was nothing spontaneous about the Holocaust. It just didn't happen. Somebody just didn't turn a switch and say, "Here is the Holocaust." It really happened as far back as Hitler coming to power. Then it started in 1933 with street riots. In 1938 came Kristallnacht, which they call the Night of Broken Glass, where all of the synagogues in Germany went up into flame. And then the Nazi bees went wild. It devoured Austria in 1938, Poland and Czechoslovakia in 1939, France in 1940. Suddenly, all of Europe was under the Nazi heel. Britain was alone, and Russia was Hitler's ally. And then when Hitler declared war on Russia in 1941, the real slaughter began. First they formed Einsatzgruppen, machine gun squads. These machine gun squads would go from village to village and from town to town, round up the Jewish people, dig mass graves, and bury them. The classic one is the Babi Yar ravine just outside of Kiev, where 32,000 men, women, and children were shot by machine gun in 2 days. Last summer, my wife, 2 of my 3 children, and I were in Kiev. And while we were in Kiev, we went to the Babi Yar ravine. It's still a fairly deep ravine, and it's now overgrown with trees and shrubs. But you know, when I looked into that ravine, I tried to put a face to that human body that held that machine gun and pulled that trigger. Or I tried to put a face on that officer who walked down that ravine with his shiny boots and pushing people in whether they were dead or alive. But you know what? I could not put a face on any of these. I could not imagine that there's a human being who can pull a trigger to shoot innocent men, women, and children. But still, the machine gun. By the way, you probably want to know why was I in Kiev. I had the need to go back to my hometown where I was born at this point in my life. And my hometown is now occupied by the Ukraine. It's part of Ukraine. And so is Kiev, being the capital. And to get to my hometown, I had to go through Kiev. But anyway, the machine gun was not efficient enough. So the modern technology of Germany went into play. And murder factories were established, where tens of thousands of people would be gassed daily, and their bodies were burned in their giant crematorium. And from throughout occupied Europe, trains were coming in by the tens of thousands of men and women and children of all stages of life, of all ages, doctors, lawyers, teachers, carpenters, students. They all had one thing in common. They were Jews and had to be killed. Even the military, the German military, took second row to Hitler's need to exterminate the Jewish people. Trains that were so badly needed at the front to bring their wounded away and to bring food and ammunition to the front were rerouted because it was more important for Hitler to bring the Jews to their deaths. I was born in Poland. When the war broke out in 1939, I was 8 years old. I lived in a fairly nice community. There were a good number of Jews with synagogues, and there was still one wall, by the way, standing up for one of the synagogues I can remember. It's now a monument protected by the Ukrainian government. But I went to public school in the morning, and I went to a religious school, which we called the Cheder, in the afternoon. I remember trudging through the snow because there were no plows, there were no lights. I used to carry a little lantern with my prayer books. I thought it was a healthy community, a happy community. The first 2 years of the war, Poland was divided between Russia and Germany. My hometown was first occupied by the Russians. And from the German-occupied Poland, refugees kept coming in. These refugees, they were mostly male, who ran away, or were able to run away. They tried to tell us about some of the early atrocities and what the neighbors did, all that. But you know, the Jews in my hometown said, these are exaggerations. Besides, this cannot happen here. These are our friends. They will protect us. My father was a fairly successful merchant. He said, I've been doing business with these people for years. We have nothing to fear. Why did these neighbors turn on their friends? Why were they so eager and willing to cooperate with the Nazi bees? Why did this Polish woman stand out there, happily seeing her neighbors rounded up and pointing out two little kids who almost made it to safety? Even now, 60, 70 years later, the hatred of Hitler and his fascist followers still remains a psychological aberration. The question often arises, why did it take so long, 15, 18, maybe even 20 years after the war was over, before schools started teaching about the Holocaust, or before synagogues started observing a day of remembrance of the Holocaust? I think it is because it took us survivors that long before we were able to talk about it. I was so good in hiding who I was, where I came from, why I spoke with an accent, that I lived with 3 men through 4 years of dental school. And it was not until they were invited to my wedding that they learned who their roommate Hersh really was. That's how good I was. Because I did not want to have to talk about it, because it was just too painful. I feel so badly now that even my own family, during their growing years, knew nothing about their father's past. Only knew that I was a Holocaust survivor, because it was a subject that was never talked about in my house. Because it was just too painful. Even today, the only time I talk about it is in a setting like this, or when I go to different schools or the synagogue, but not on a one-to-one basis. Because I still find it painful. It was my oldest daughter, Rosalind, who put the first crack in that heavy wall that I built around myself. She was a freshman in high school, and she asked her history teacher to invite me to speak about the war, about the Holocaust. Not about myself. The teacher made it clear, just in general. I found myself in a dilemma. I didn't want to say no to her, but yet I knew it would be much too painful, much too difficult for me. So once again, I used my ingenuity. I obtained a film strip on the Holocaust, which was accompanied by a tape. And all I had to do was push a button. We did not have to talk about it. That became a yearly occurrence, and as time went on, it became a little easier. And I started introducing the film strip and then talk about it, and finally a little bit about myself. Furthermore, I think, it took the free world that long to realize that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not a group of terrorists, but an organized government. A nation that prided itself in its culture, and whose culture commanded universal respect. A nation that gave birth to Beethoven and Schiller and Goethe, also gave birth to Auschwitz and Dachau and Buchenwald. Gas chambers where tens of thousands of people would die daily, and whose bodies were burned in a giant crematorium. The rest of the civilized world stood by silently It is not a well-known fact that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused to acknowledge and focus on the issue of Nazi genocide. Do you know Hitler offered 1 million Jews to Great Britain in exchange for 10,000 trucks? And the British government said, we can't do that. What are we going to do with 1 million Jews? It's such a painful thought to me because I can't help to think, what if Hitler had done this? What if Great Britain had accepted Hitler's offer? Maybe my sister, Shanchi, would have been one of that million to be alive today. Even as late as 1944, the Allied bombers were forbidden to bomb the concentration camps, or even the railroad tracks leading to the concentration camps. They could have saved tens of thousands of people because the influx would have slowed up. But they were told, this is not our war. If you have any extra bombs, drop them into the ocean, not on a concentration camp. So, can we afford to let these same nations to lull themselves into forgetfulness? If I may quote Edmund Burke, who said it so eloquently, quote, all that is necessary for the forces of evil to win in this world is for enough good people to do nothing. That is why I'm so glad to see all of you here today. Because I am probably the last generation of Holocaust survivors. And if we're no longer here, who is going to say never again? Who's going to remember what prejudice and bigotry and hatred can do? Let me share with you another story, how neighbor can turn against neighbor. It was in the fall of 1944. I was hiding with about a dozen other Jews in the forest. The forest was not far from a Ukrainian village. And the reason the peasants left us alone was because they thought we were very heavily armed, and they only known the extent of our ammunition. It consisted of 2 revolvers, 2 bullets each, so they were never really tried and we didn't know if they worked or not. But we did have a sort of shotgun with an adequate supply of bullets. And the men would go around in different parts of the forest during the course of the day and just shoot off at the gun. So that the peasants thought there were lots of us with lots of ammunition. About at the same time, the German government decreed that all the churches are to turn in their brass bells. The German government, the machinery, must have been running out of brass. And when the soldiers came to this particular village, to this particular Ukrainian village, to collect the bells from that church, they didn't find any because the peasants had hidden them. They became quite upset. Until one of the farmers, one of the neighbors, came forward and said, don't be angry. I'm going to take you to a place where there are Jews hiding, and you can take them back into town. And that'll be a much bigger reward to you than the 2 brass bells which you did not find here. Fortunately for us, we had a lookout at the edge of the forest. And when he saw the 2 trucks approaching the forest, he came running in saying, the Germans are coming, Germans are coming. And we all dispersed deep into the forest. Fortunately, by the time the soldiers approached our area, they didn't find any of us. But they did collect whatever few meagerly possessions we left behind. They poured some gasoline on them and put them on fire. I lost 2 very dear things that particular day. One was the only pair of shoes that I owned. With winter approaching and my shoes being threadbare, and it was the only pair that I had, I tried to save them as much as I could and I walked around barefoot. That was one of the warmer days. But the bigger loss that I lost that day was the only picture that I had of my family. Whenever I was hungry or scared, but especially when I was lonely, I would take the picture, go off and sit on a retreat, and look at my beautiful sister's faces and my mother's gentle face. But what I remember the most are my father's eyes, who looked out from that picture and told me that I must survive. I must survive because someday I may have to bear witness of one man's inhumanity to his fellow man. And yes, I'm sure you've heard that our voices out there now who say that the Holocaust never happened. Let me read you a little excerpt here. The same day I saw my first horror camp, I visited every nook and cranny. I felt that it may be my duty to be in a position from then on to testify about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of the Nazi brutality were just propaganda. Signed, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander of the UN Forces. But yet there are still voices out there who say that the Holocaust never happened. If you've seen the movie Schindler's List, it was out a few years ago, there was a scene where a Nazi officer takes the revolver out from his holster and puts a bullet to the head of a pregnant woman. He stands there and watches the blood and the brain discolored, the white, beautiful snow around her, and he just walks away as if nothing ever happened. And there are those voices out there who say that this too could not have happened, that there's nothing more than a figment of Spielberg's brilliant imagination. I would like to go back to January 1943. My mother, my two sisters, who were still alive, and I. My mother and my two sisters and I were hiding. Well, not hiding. We were in the ghetto. We already had a ghetto at that time in our town. Again, Mother had made arrangements with a farmer that if she sends word to him that there is an Aktion being predicted, that he will come and pick us up and hide us in his farm. It was getting there towards the end, and they were predicting some big Aktions. So Mother sent word to Michal to pick us up after sunset. And one by one we snuck out of the ghetto. By the way, the punishment, if they catch you coming out of the ghetto, again, was immediate death. But this having been a little smaller town, so the ghetto was not as guarded as some of the larger ones, like you've heard of Warsaw, Krakow, or any of those. We met Michal on the outskirts of town, and he put us into his sleigh, covered us with blankets and hay, and took us to his farm. He built an ingenious hiding place in his barn, which was just big enough for the four of us to lie side by side or sit up, but of course not high enough to stand up. But that was probably a blessing because we only had one blanket between us, so we needed the body heat to keep us warm. As predicted, 2 days later, there was a very, very large Aktion, and thousands of people, including a number of my families, extended family, were caught and taken to concentration camps. The next day after the Akция, Mother said we really need to go back into the ghetto because Michal's grades were rather high and she needed to save her savings. But again, she said, let's go back in twos. So if we're caught, we don't go all together. She and I went first. Michal brought us back to the same place where he picked us up, and we successfully snuck back into the ghetto. Next day, we get up before sunrise, and we expect my sisters to come. But we wait, and wait, and they did not appear. Of course, we realized something must have gone wrong. Mother again risked her life and ran out into the farmer's market, which was adjacent to our ghetto. And all she heard there was people talking about these two beautiful Jewish girls who were this morning shot in Michal's front lawn. How can any of us feel or empathize with a mother who just heard two of her children were killed? She came running back into the ghetto with her hands waving in the air and crying, "They killed me. They killed me without a knife." And when she reached the door to our building, she collapsed. We carried her upstairs. We lived on the second floor in one room with two other families. And she stayed in bed for about 2 or 3 days, barely eating or drinking, just repeating their names over and over again. But yet she would get up early every morning before sunrise and go to the window, hoping that there was nothing more than a dream, a bad nightmare. But when reality finally set in, she decided she has to bring her 2 children back to town where she can give them a Jewish burial, something she could not give her husband or her youngest daughter. She found somebody who was willing to go and Jew their bodies and bring them back to the cemetery. She also paid off so that she and I can go out to the cemetery in daylight. It was there that I saw the bodies of my 2 sisters, each with a bullet hole in her head, inflicted by a Nazi officer. I can't possibly cover the magnitude of the Holocaust. It's an event unparalleled in human history. It's a story so complex and statistics so numbing that it escapes comprehension. If I, who lived through it, find it now difficult to believe that such atrocities could happen, that one human being can do this to another. It is, of course, presumptuous of me to think that I can make anybody here feel. A number of years ago, my wife and I went to Poland. I went to Poland because I wanted to see the farmer who hid me out the last few months of the war. It was at his attic that I was liberated. Of course, we must not forget, when we talk about the Holocaust and all the bad people, we must not forget that there were some good people. There was a forest in Israel that was called the Forest of the Righteous. There were some good people, and he was one of them. But unfortunately, very, very few. I particularly wanted to see his 2 children. His 2 children were my age at the time when I was hiding in their house. And again, I wanted to thank them for having the courage to be silent and not to tell that there was this little Jewish boy hiding in their attic. And while we were in Poland, we went to Auschwitz. And no matter how many pictures I've seen or books I've read about Auschwitz, it was not until I was actually there that I could realize the extent, the the human destruction that took place. I can't put into words how I felt when I first saw those infamous railroad tracks converging onto this little gate with the inscription above it, Arbeit macht frei. Deception, work, makes free. And when I walked through the gate, I had to touch it. I had to touch it because I had to prove it to myself that it was really in existence, it was really real. That through this little gate, 3 million plus Jews, and then some non-Jews too, went through. And only a few small handfuls came back out alive. How can you put into words the pain you feel when you see a mound of human hair estimated to weigh 7 tons? Because the Nazis would shave the heads of their victims before they would put them through the crematorium. Maybe they didn't mind the smell of flesh, human flesh, but they didn't mind the smell of burning head. How can you describe the pain you feel when you see a room with tens of thousands of little baby shoes, whose victims were gassed in this gas chamber? Or pictures of mutilated bodies who were the end result of Nazi experiments, like those of Dr. Mengele, men who've taken the oath of healing to experiment, to see how far a human body can take. And some of them do not even look human anymore. To that extent, I couldn't stay there any longer, and I asked my wife that we should leave. When on their way out, this Polish woman opened a concealed door, and she said, "Tutaj proszę, come in here." We walked in, and it was a dimly lit room, and inside that room, in the center of the floor, there was a crib, an illuminated crib. And in that crib, there was the Star of David, surrounded by broken pieces of marble. And as we were gazing into this crib, out of the darkness came the chanting, which translated, chanting in Hebrew, El Malei Rachamim, which means a merciful God who lives up on high and are full of compassion. With that, I could not contain myself any longer, and I started to cry. Where did I say do we Jews get enough strength to be able to say, "O Heavenly God, who lives up on high and are full of compassion," in the place where 3 million of our brothers and sisters were so brutally murdered? And when this prayer was over, my wife suggested we say another prayer that we say after our dead, which says, "Magnified and sanctified be the name of the Lord." We say that on the anniversaries of the death. In that particular moment, I could not bring myself to say, "Magnified and sanctified be the name of the Lord." And with my face wet with tears, I walked out of the building. My wife joined me a few minutes later. No words passed between us as we continued walking the streets of Auschwitz. And then we saw a little sign with an arrow pointing to gas chamber and crematorium number 1. The palpitations that I felt when I first saw those railroad tracks became tenfold. And when I reached the iron door leading into the gas chamber, it took me a few minutes before I had enough courage to go inside. But once inside, it was an innocently looking room. It looked like any big shower room that you can see in a gymnasium or a health facility. But I knew that out of the spigots in the ceiling did not come hot and cold water, but cyclone number 2. The deadliest of poisonous gases developed especially for this purpose by Nazi chemists. As I stood there, I wondered how many tens of thousands of people stood in the very same place that I was standing in, but they did not breathe the air that I was breathing. They were breathing cyclone number 2. And in my mind's eye, I could picture the naked body and embracing the naked body next to her Mahur. And together they were screaming, "Oh Lord our God, help us." But those iron doors were shut so tightly, neither God nor man could hear or wanted to hear. No, at that moment all I wanted to scream was, "God, oh God, why did you desert us?" But when I entered the adjoining room, which was the crematorium, and I saw a row of ovens, and in my mind's eye I could see those large flames engulfing those poor, innocent, naked bodies who just moments before were sacrificed on the altar of martyrdom. It became very clear to me that no matter how I feel, how painful it may be for me to talk about the Holocaust, I must go out and speak to people like you. Because history has a way of softening tragedy and grief and to blur the rough edges of pain, even if inflicted on a monumental scale. Future generations will be better served if we take steps today to preserve the truth, again, no matter how painful it may be. We must instill in ourselves and our future generations a simple saying, never again. So when we go home today and tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after tomorrow, remember the words of the great American Henry David Thoreau who once said, "It is never too late to give up our prejudices." Sorry about that.